What's up, everybody? Special episode and a special guest joining us. I'm Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast, and we love this partnership with the Believe Podcast Network as they always bring us the guests, the stars. We love it, and we've got one of the co-hosts of the Believe in Saints podcast. You can hear him there. He does a lot of great coverage for, if you're a basketball fan, the Pelicans. He covers them. He does a lot of great stuff. David Grubb joining us from the Believe in Saints podcast. David, what's going on, man? Big weekend in the Big Easy this coming Sunday.
Yeah, we're past the preliminary stage now. We're not quite a third of the way through the season, but this is the time of the year where you start figuring out who teams really are.
There is, and that's what this game really kind of is a barometer of, right? I mean, it's like who are these two teams? Because they both I would think, I guess we can kind of start there. Is there a sense of kind of underachievement by the Saints? I mean, I knew there was going to be some quarterback questions, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But I mean, 2-3, right? And you look around, they revamped the wide receiver core with Landry and Olave, and then you're getting Michael Thomas back. There's some questions at quarterback. You have Kamara. You've got a lot of weapons. I mean, is there a sense of underachievement at 2-3 at this point? I know there is in Bengals Nation, so I'm curious about that on the Saints side of the fence.
Yeah, up until last week, the Saints had led the NFL in 3 of the categories that tell you you're a really bad team. They were number 1 in 3 and outs, they were number 1 in penalties, and they were number 1 in turnovers. That's just not who the Saints have been, the team that we've known over the last 15 years. The Saints have been a team that takes care of the football, that's been known for its efficiency offensively, and was one of the top 5 defenses in the league each of the past 3 seasons. So, yeah, there's a lot of sense of underachievement because they got beat up, quite frankly, through the first 4 games of the season. Every opponent that they had, whether it was Atlanta, Tampa Bay, Minnesota, it just didn't matter. Carolina, they punched the Saints in the mouth and they didn't respond in those games. And I think that outside of really the fourth quarter against Atlanta and then what they did last week offensively, there has not been a lot of good football from the New Orleans Saints. And that's not what they were banking on when they kept pretty much the entire group together from last year, even after Sean Payton left.
Well, what does Saints fans make of Dennis Allen? I mean, obviously he had a real rough go of it as a head coach his first time with the Raiders, but we all know the Raiders are and can be a bit of a mess. So I don't know if he truly got a fair shake there, but here he is. I kind of got a raw deal with the random Payton retirement that kind of sort of, at least from those of us on the outside looking in, came out of the blue. And so now he's taking over as the head coach. They're 2-3 this year. I mean, what's kind of the sense with him among the fan base and those who cover the team?
Well, I think there's 2 things. One is people don't doubt Dennis Allen's competency when it comes to structure and putting things together. I mean, clearly the defense did extremely well under his guidance over the last few years. But the thing is, I think there were always people who had concerns in the NFL. Continuity of coaching staffs has not necessarily panned out. When a coach has handed the job down to someone else essentially in the building, that hasn't traditionally panned out. I think the last time for me that I can remember is George Seifert taking over for Bill Walsh back with the 49ers. I mean, you just don't see it happen very often. And then I think also you have to look at Pete Carmichael, the offensive coordinator, who initially turned down the job, said he didn't want to be the offensive coordinator, then took it. He's getting a lot of scrutiny as well because the Saints offense has just been so inconsistent, even with, like you talked about at the top, that upgrade in talent around the quarterback position.
Talking with David Grubb, the co-host of Believe in Saints, co-hosts that with former Saints wide receiver Terrence Copper, and does a lot of great sports coverage, Pelicans coverage, New Orleans Saints coverage. He covers the bases out there.
Baseball, LSU.
Yeah. You name it, you cover it, my man. You're a versatile guy, unlike me. I do this lame little football show here, and that's all I got, man. Hey, all right. Well, this came through about an hour before you and I are going live here, and this is a tweet from Adam Schefter. It is official. For the 3rd time in 3 seasons since leaving the Cincinnati Bengals, Andy Dalton will be facing his old team as a starter. He is 2-0 with an asterisk next to one of them because he exited the Bears game but really before the first half was over. But technically he is 2-0 against his former team. What I was planning to ask you was, is who's going to start, what's the latest on Jameis? Well, we know that part now, but I guess my question is and I talked about this with my co-host on Wednesday, is it almost better for the Saints at this point to have Dalton starting just because of the riskiness that comes with Jameis Winston, the propensity for turnovers that come with Jameis Winston, whereas Andy Dalton, maybe especially at this point in his career, game manager, maybe risk averse a little bit and letting the game kind of come to him as opposed to forcing the issue. I don't know if I'm just talking out of my rear end here by saying that, but I almost wonder if that's the better option for the Saints.
Well, I think for the short term right now it is, but primarily because of Jameis's health. I mean, he has 3 fractures in his back, and they weren't on the spine where it was damaging, potentially, damaging to his mobility as an individual. But for football's sake, when you've got 3 fractures in your spine, it's pretty bad. And for Jameis to be a guy who uses a lot of velocity with his arm, where they wanted to use the big play with Chris Olave, they wanted to go down the field more. Jameis trying to make those attempts, he wasn't getting the same kind of velocity on the ball down the field. He was leaving a lot of passes short where they were sailing. And that happens when you don't have good mechanics down low. Last year, we didn't see that out of Jameis. This was a guy who, when he got hurt last season, was leading the NFL in red zone efficiency, 14 touchdowns, 3 picks. He had been a very solid quarterback. So I think the injury had a lot to do with that. And then the guys around him were injured. With Andy, and now that you're asking him, along with Taysom Hill, to do a more limited offense, I think as you've taken the receivers away, no Michael Thomas again this week, no Jarvis Landry again this week. You'll probably have, Chris Olave will probably sit out because of the concussion protocol as well. So again, you're going with those backup receivers. It's better to have somebody who is risk averse, who's going to check down and give Alvin Kamara 8 to 9 catches out of the backfield. And we saw how effective he was doing that last week. So yeah, I think for the next, until Jameis is 100%, and I think that's what the Saints are really gearing to for that last 7-week stretch of the season, and hoping that wide receiver group is healthy, the running backs are healthy, and Jameis is healthy, and they can make a run to the playoffs and try to sneak in maybe at 9-8 or 10-7. That's possible. But right now, I think Andy Dalton is the better choice.
Talking with David Grubb, one of the co-hosts of the Believe in Saints podcast. I pinned the link to that show, and we'll hear more about it in just a little bit. He co-hosts that with former Saints wide receiver Terrence Copper. Happy to be chatting with him as we preview this big game going forward. You mentioned his name just a second ago, David. Taysom Hill. It's not Alvin Kamara who leads the team in rushing yards. It is Taysom Hill, and he has been breaking off huge plays. And so now I wonder, not only with you got Jameis out this week, right? And so it's Andy Dalton's turn. And now on top of that, you have a very limited, you just talked about this, a very limited wide receiver core because of the injuries to Saints wideouts. So now how big of a workload is Taysom Hill going to have this week? He's always kind of been a niche or a rotational guy in different respects. I think in fantasy leagues, he's labeled as a tight end.
Yes.
So I mean, I guess amount of touches now that you expect him to get with all of the injuries on the wide receiver front.
Well, I think the thing that Taysom and Alvin do for each other is allow each other to stay under their pitch count. There was Sean Payton set a very hard number with Alvin Kamara up until last season when he didn't have a choice because of all the injuries, but he didn't like giving Alvin more than 25 touches a game. The same as with Taysom. You don't want him to get a whole bunch of touches. It's when do you use him? How do you use him? And I think that's the thing, because Taysom took a shot too in the game last week and was listed on the injury report. He took a good shot to the ribs, and he's been fragile at times because of the way he plays. So you have to keep them both and use them sparingly, but effectively. So I think you'll see Taysom as a tone setter, and that's what he did really well last week. That's what he did in week 1 against the Falcons, is you allow him and his physicality to set a tone for the team, to set a tone for an offensive line that struggled. And if you're the Saints and you could get back to, I don't know if they'll get 40 plus rushing attempts again this week against the Bengals, who are a better defense clearly than what the Seahawks have. But they want to be over 30 carries and give those to Taysom, give those to Alvin, and sprinkle in some Mark Ingram there as well, and make sure that they're getting those touches and trying to maintain that balance and not be a pass-heavy offense.
So That's it. You kind of answered one of my questions there. What does this mean for the offensive line here then? With again the injuries, backup quarterback. We may maybe a little bit more conservative on offense in terms of play calling and what they may want to do. What does this mean for this offensive line, and how have they been performing? I know you have James Hurst out there and Trevor Penning. Ryan Ramczyk's been nursing some injuries and whatnot as well. How has this group looked now that Terron Armstead is no longer on the team, and they've kind of had to rebuild that a little bit?
It's been a struggle for them, particularly in pass protection. They have not done well from week to week. Cesar Ruiz, their first-round draft pick a couple years ago, has underperformed no matter what positions he's been in, whether it's center or guard. Eric McCoy, who was on track, probably an all-pro center, has been just good this year. Ryan Ramczyk, who was an all-pro, has been just good at times this year. Sometimes he's been really bad, but that left side in particular, the Saints offensive line, has been its biggest issue. Andrus Peat continues to be inconsistent there. So I think that the Saints want to do, again, is you have to try to get these guys to go be physical. And the best way for any offensive line is to move forward. And this line, a lot of penalties, a lot of plays that have been called back. And I think you have less of a chance of that with the run game. So for the Saints, do what other teams have been doing to you, and that's shorten the ball game by grinding it out, playing field position, and utilizing this offensive line as a battering ram rather than trying to count on them to give Andy Dalton enough time to make throws downfield. You can get those quick 2 or 3 second, 3-step drops, maybe even a 5. But Dalton's going to have to get rid of the ball quickly against a Bengals team that does like to apply pressure.
Well, David, you talked about this before we took the air here, and I'd love for you to kind of relay your sentiments there of what you think is going to happen in terms of former, and primarily on the defense, former Bengals. This is a big game in the way of obviously a group of former LSU Tigers coming to town, and we're talking from Joe Burrow all the way down to Tyler Shelvin. I mean, there's a big group of LSU Tigers on that national champion team that are coming back to the area for the first time as pros. But you also, we talked about the guys on defense who were former New Orleans Saints, Trey Hendrickson, Eli Apple, Von Bell. For one of those players in particular, I'm sure there's no love lost there, but your anticipation of the reaction to those guys coming in here, and it could be, based on what you're telling me there, it could be a big day potentially for Hendrickson, who's had a nice career, especially over the past few years here.
Yeah, I think for Vaughn and Trey, it's much more of a, you used to be a Saint, we liked you, but you play for the other team, so we're going to boo you. For Eli Apple, it's personal. City of New Orleans and Eli, that's personal. They are, I've had people ask me this week on a couple other shows, is it like, do you think that there's anything that Eli Apple could do the rest of his life that would make New Orleans get off his back? And I'm like, this is New Orleans. New Orleans holds grudges on Roger Goodell. New Orleans holds grudges on he could. I mean, like, the best hope for Eli Apple is that people forget he exists in New Orleans. Like, that's really the thing. But for 3 hours, they're not. And anytime his head is seen, and I guarantee they'll put it on Jumbotron, if there's a play that gets made in his vicinity, it's just going to rain down. The LSU guys, they're going to get it easy unless they score. Like, they'll get, a cheer when they come in. I would imagine you'll see.
That's where this question is from a fan. Yeah. Brian's asking about
there'll be people wearing those LSU Burrow jerseys. They won't be wearing, there'll be Bengals jerseys. There'll be a few. But from Louisiana folks, not the folks fans traveling who are Bengals fans. There'll be a few Louisiana fans who adopted Cincinnati as their second team. There were plenty during the Super Bowl. But it'll stop once the pregame introductions are done. They give your acknowledgement. Joe hasn't been back since, the national championship, hasn't been in the dome. So they'll get their acknowledgement. But once the game starts, unless they score, people will kind of ignore them more than anything else. They'll cheer the team. They won't boo Joe. They won't boo Jamar unless they score. If they score, nah, all bets are off.
Talking with David Grubb, who is one of the co-hosts of the Believe in Saints podcast, does a lot of different sports coverage for teams in the New Orleans area. He is on Twitter at DM Grubb. Go give him a follow and listen to the Believe in Saints podcast. He co-hosts that with former Saints wide receiver Terrence Copper. And we one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, just because you mentioned his name right now, and I obviously going back to the region and where he played college ball and excelled, Joe Burrow. Some of the early career comparisons, whether it's in the draft or after last year with his great success that he had fully, kind of fully healthy, a lot of comparisons, oddly enough, are to Drew Brees. Now, obviously, there's a size difference. Burrow's about 6'3", 6'4", maybe, and Brees is 6 foot on a good day, so a little bit of a size difference. But I think when you talk about arm strength, good, not absolute elite, but you talk about pocket elusiveness and field vision, anticipation, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of things that make sense. And oh, by the way, they both played college and or pro ball in a similar region. So I'm curious. You've seen a lot of Joe Burrow. You've seen a lot of Drew Brees in your time. Do you connect any dots there? Do you take any stock in that? I know it's still really early in Burrow's career and he hasn't played absolutely great this year, but I'm just kind of curious if anybody from your specific region kind of holds that and says, yeah, I do see a Drew Brees type of player here.
I think the style comparisons aren't there. Like you said, they're very different stylistically. But I think the thing that they both have that is the common characteristic, and I think the thing that they connected on while Joe was down here, is they are both insatiable when it comes to their appetite for understanding and thinking about football. They always want to be better, and they're always pushing their teammates. And their teammates also understand that work ethic. The great story about Joe Burrow when he came down from Ohio State, and again, Louisiana is not a place that traditionally has taken on guys from the North. We've had a lot of players leave the Louisiana and go on and have success other places, but hasn't taken on a lot of Midwestern kids at LSU. So Joe Burrow comes in at day one and establishes himself as somebody not only who's going to compete for that starting job, but as who's going to be a voice in that locker room. And I think that's the same thing. Drew Brees came into New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, knowing that locker room needed a voice, knowing that it needed a leader, and he assumed that role and he wore it like Captain America, essentially. And I mean, that's how he viewed in New Orleans. Brees is, that's what they call him. So that perception of just, he was the embodiment of what you wanted your franchise player, your franchise quarterback to be. And I think Joe Burrow has those similar qualities. He's a winner. Despite what's been happening this season, it's been more difficult than it was last year. But coming back is always more difficult after going to Super Bowl. But he is a winner. He's a guy that everybody, whether it's offense or defense, in a locker room relates to and likes. And he's genuine. I think that's the thing that comes across from Joe Burrow more than anything and makes guys want to compete for him and with him, is that you don't feel like you're being, told something. You don't being sold something. Joe Burrow is who he is. And I think that is going to make him a very successful quarterback for a very long time beyond the noticeable and obvious physical skills that he has.
Well put. Let's transition a little bit to Saints defensive scheme under Dennis Allen and what they are going to try and do this week. A lot of teams have been doing the Tampa 2 or 2 deep safeties on the Bengals this year and have limited the damage from Jamar Chase. In that regard, the teams that have not done that, oddly enough, the Bengals have beaten this year. That's where they've, the Jets and the Dolphins at times did not do that, and the Bengals took advantage of it. My understanding, and I could be a complete dummy, but my understanding is that the Saints don't run a ton of that, and they really, in terms of a go-to receiver on the opposition, they kind of say, hey, Lattimore, that's your guy. We're going to leave you one-on-one most of the time and do our thing. I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but is that the game plan, and or might they alter it a little bit and emulate what a lot of these teams have done that have been effective? It's been effective against the Bengals so far this year.
Well, I think what the Saints are counting on is for Marshawn, and after he kind of had a difficult game last week against DK Metcalf at times, gave up some big plays, and gave up some plays to Justin Jefferson the week before. Marshawn tends to have these moments. But then he comes back and he steps up to the challenge and plays at an all-pro level. So I think that's what they're hoping for. Marcus May should be back. They expect him to play this weekend. That's a big addition back to the secondary and the safety set, which allows you to do more things with Tyrann Mathieu and May, who are both good in coverage and at the line of scrimmage. The Saints really need to get 4 at home. Joe's taking a lot of hits, and that line has allowed a lot of sacks. The Saints have over the last 2 weeks, first 3 weeks, no pressure. Last 2 weeks, more pressure from that front four. So I think that's going to be something to watch. Is can Granderson, can Cam Jordan get home without the Saints having to send pressure from the linebackers or from the safeties? That's the biggest thing for the Saints. When the Saints don't get pressure, they get beat. And they gave Geno Smith time. They gave, the week before, you can't give the Vikings, that kind of time and allow them to get the ball downfield. So that's the biggest thing for me is I think the Saints and their pressure up front. Linebackers have been fantastic this season, Pete Werner in particular, but the Saints D-line has been inconsistent at times.
David, before we get your takes on, you kind of mentioned a couple of key players and key matchups here. Before we get your prediction and just kind of how you think things may ebb and flow this Sunday, definitely want to have you talk about your show here, the Believe in Saints podcast. I pinned the link in the live chats. You co-host that with Terrence Copper. When are you on the air? Where can people find it? And where can people follow you, especially this weekend with the big game coming up?
Yeah, of course, at DM Grub and at Believe Saints on Twitter. And we go twice a week, Monday and usually Friday. But if something breaks during the week, we'll change up that day. And it's a really great conversation. Terrence covers the X's and O's and breaks those things down. And I provide my observations and insights as well. It's fast moving, usually 20 to 25 minutes. And we really enjoy what we do. So I invite folks to check it out because it's not just good Saints coverage. I think it's good football conversation.
Well, you've definitely proven that with what you've given us today. I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything here. We've got a couple of, first of all, another great Bengals podcast out there, Bengals and Brews. We already talked a little Andy, so you guys got to go back to the beginning and talk a little Andy. But again, what do you think will happen? And by the way, if that is Dale, who is writing on that Bengals and Brews thing, my best to you, Dale. I know you got a lot of family things going on, so my best to you, buddy. And then, of course, we've got another comment in our YouTube chat. What's the score prediction from Foxy there? I don't know, David. What do you think, man? The injuries are really kind of a key thing in this game, particularly for the Saints. For the Bengals side of things, Higgins has been practicing, but there's been stuff where he practices and then he gets to the game and then he has to leave the game early because of the ankle issue and other stuff going on there. And this offense is different without him for sure. I don't know, man. What do you think?
This has been tearing me up all week because I've gone both ways on this game. I think it's a lower scoring game because I think the Saints in particular after last week are really going to try to slow the pace of this game down. They don't want to play in the upper 30s again and get into a shootout with Cincinnati, which I think is more capable of making big plays. I think this game probably comes down to a field goal because Cincinnati, a lot of their games this season,
it's like basically the whole year. Yeah.
And more than half of the Saints games have come down to a kick at the end of the game. So I think this is a one possession game. I'll say right now, and I'll say it just because I got to represent the city. I'll say Saints 24-21. That's what I'll say. But honestly, I feel like this is a game that is a pick 'em. It's that close.
It very well could be. I know the injuries kind of play a big role in it. And then, again, there is a whale of a difference between 3-3 and 2-4. So I think both of these teams are really, really hungry for this one. Then, of course, the emotion with Eli Apple, Trey Hendrickson, Von Bell coming back, and all of those LSU Tigers from that championship team a couple of years ago coming back to the area. The atmosphere should be very cool and very electric and just a fun game for two teams that don't get to face each other very much. So looking forward to that. David, thanks for the time, man. I appreciate it. I know we caught you last minute there, but you stepped in and you killed it, man. I appreciate it. Enjoy this weekend.
Good. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. And I hope we get to do it again maybe next year.
Yeah, maybe. Or hey, Super Bowl maybe, right?
Maybe Super Bowl. Yeah, might do it at Super Bowl. All right. Thanks for having me, man.
Take care, David.